The Focus C15 began in August 2013 when myself and 28 other young mums lived in a hostel, the people up there. And we was being evicted from our hostel in Stratford, and we was being forced to places like Manchester, Hastings and Birmingham. So we stood up and started fighting back for decent social housing for all. In Newham and across the country, we've been and spoke at many different places. We've had occupations of buildings, and we've networked with so many people.
I just want to say eFocus 15 is amazing. It just gets people fighting back the councils. And I joined them in 2014 after I was homeless with my children.
One of our biggest challenges is fighting against Newham's Labour Mayor Robin Wells, who many times has shut the campaign out of meetings and tried to silence us at every opportunity. But we put up a massive fight against him and show that we're not going to give in and we're not going to give up and we're going to fight back. And I'll just quickly add as well, the 29 mums from the hostel we were all rehoused in Newham, but some of the mums have now been moved away, and we've met loads of other people since then that have got really serious problems with their housing.
So basically the Localism Act gave local authorities the powers to place homeless households in private rented accommodation, whereas previously they could go on a waiting list until they got a council house. But because rents are so high in London, local authorities such as Newham said, we're going to put you in rented housing, and if you say no, you're going to be intentionally homeless, which means you're no longer entitled to any support from us. And because rents are so high in London and because there's a benefits cap, we can't afford to house you in London, so we're going to offer you a house in Birmingham or Manchester. If you say no to this house, then you're intentionally homeless and you get nothing more from us.
People would literally come out of their appointment with a list that whoever they'd seen, the housing officer on duty, had given them of the prices of rent in Manchester and Birmingham and Hastings and places outside of London, and like some names sometimes of some estate agents, letting agents to look up. So it's really insipid and really present in everything they're doing. They're saying go.
The offers were as far away as Lancashire and Newcastle, and what we found is that Newham, there's something called the National Homelessness Advice Centre Best Practice about out-of-borough placements, so which says if you're going to move people, here's what you should do. And it includes giving people funding for travel, it includes telling people about schools, about health services, and we think that they're not following any of this. People are just put somewhere and told something like it's leafy. That's as much as one person was told, and not given any knowledge about where they're going or how they can actually connect back to where they're from.
People who accepted an out-of-borough placement would often go there and find themselves in terrible conditions as well. So even if you accept an out-of-borough placement, that's not the end of the story. You were often still in really bad housing conditions.
Most worryingly, 89% mentioned worsening mental health as a result of their situation. 66% reporting depression, 25% insomnia, 9% self-harm.
It's really, really scaring people, and also housing is really, really draining people and making them so unable to cope that people are scared to ask for help because they're scared that they're going to be judged and their children will just be snatched away from them, because that's a massive fear that so many people have, that when they turn to people, then the first thing that's going to happen is their children are going.
We're also looking to expand the research to other boroughs and other cities. So it's now recently come out that it's not just London boroughs that are using out-of-borough placements, but other local authorities around the country are also displacing homeless households. And so we want to look at it nationally, and we want to work quite closely with psychologists and health experts as part of this expanded research project. So hopefully that's something we can talk about today. One of the things that has kind of come about around at the same time as the research was the Focus C15, housing is a mental health issue.
We haven't actually received any support from the local council or anyone like that, but we've had an amazing response from the local community and people around us. Like, we meet so many people at our street stall every week. That's the main support that we need, and that's what's going to keep us going on, because we're the people that are affected and we're going to fight back.
I just wanted to add about that there's a couple like local politicians who either like maybe came down to the occupation when we occupied empty houses on Carpenter's estate, or that have come down to our Saturday store a couple times to try and appease relationships, but actually are always full of hot air. I mean, also Lynn Brown also promised in the early days of the campaign all the women who were being evicted from Focus E15 washing machines, which she never delivered on and never picked up her phone about, and that's generally been the case. Of knocking on doors or people sometimes offering to speak about things, but just being full of hot air.
I just wanted to add as well, like what you were talking about with kind of people not turning up to surgeries and not listening to your talking, it's very much what we reflected in our research was that, and kind of informally, was that it's a bit of a deliberate strategy. Like, we noticed that there was this pattern of mums when they first came into the hostels, and they call it temporary accommodation. I met a kid who'd been there for 9 years. That is not temporary by any standard. You come in and people spend the first year fighting desperately to get out, fighting to get a house. They'd go to surgeries, they'd like talk about points, they try and learn as much as they can about the system. And then by that point, it's so difficult being homeless. People just lose heart and lose faith, and they just kind of resign themselves to this position. And at that point, that's when we started noticing things taking like a real dip. So some of the work we did was about kind of getting people to be able to even occupy the space in their own hostel. Like, for some reason they keep the playroom locked, things like that. So it was kind of little tiny steps at the beginning, but I think it's really important to not in any way think that it's not a deliberate strategy to keep people silenced, and to absolutely just identify that this is something that needs to be actively addressed, because a lot of stuff gets palmed off as like being forgotten or being oversubscribed or just no one having thought about it. But it's just really not the case at all, and actually those daily hassles and those tiny little grinds are really the bits that get to people in the end. It's the kind of like, it just builds up, and then at some point it just becomes way too much.
And also, children are having to move schools so much now. Their education's being affected, everything's being affected. Parents are not able to keep their jobs, so they're really like trying to set working class families up to fail, and it's definitely tactical. It's not something that's just accidentally happened.
Our property was put on the market. We were being told that they were going to increase basically double our rent to something like £1,400 per month per room. At that time, I just lost my job, and so I fought a bit of a rearguard action against the estate agents who were driving this. They were coming around showing people the place without notifying us, breaking all the rules. And eventually I was able to stop this process, to basically get Barnard Marcus agents sacked, and to basically self-manage this property. But what it taught me was that there's basically no support network particularly for renters. I was in constant contact with organisations like Shelter, with Citizens Advice Bureau, and they were all telling me that their funding was being cut and they had to kind of really sort of scale back the support they're giving people. And it sort of woke me up to the scale of the crisis facing London. And my background, I'm a former town planner, so I used to work in local authorities and local government. And so at that point I started researching the links between local authorities and financial management, and started doing a lot of research into how they're being run. Initially that sort of focused on Vauxhall, but very quickly my kind of radar was extended and councils like Newham came onto my radar. So I first heard about the Focus E15 campaign, I think, in early 2014, and I just uncovered a particular type of loan which was costing the council millions of pounds, and at the same time was hearing stories from people like Jasmine that the Focus E15 hostel was being closed to save Newham Council £40,000 a year. And I was looking at their accounts, and I could see that the council was bleeding millions of pounds a year, borrowing from the banks when they shouldn't have been, and I was absolutely appalled by it. And so basically what we're trying to do is expose the negative elements of a highly indebted society, particularly in the UK, sort of household debt, which is again coming up to levels we saw in the financial crisis, and our focus obviously has been on local authority debt. Basically what we're trying to do is provide information and tools to campaigners working on things like housing, kind of link up finance, democracy and service provision at the local level. Since 2010 we've had enormous cuts to local authority budgets. Talking about around about 40% decline in central government funding to town halls. Basically all central government support will be stopped to local authorities by the end of this decade, so we know central government grant. Council will be entirely reliant upon money they raise locally, business rates, council tax. What that's forcing them to do, it's forcing councils to behave like speculators, like hedge funds. So literally this morning in the Financial Times, we have an article about councils building up a credit bubble. What are they doing? They're borrowing from government to invest in commercial property to get profits coming in from that to replace what they're losing in government grant. Problem is, if property prices go down, they've got no money to fund services. So the ability of councils like Newham to fund housing, social care, is now reliant on maintaining an enormous housing bubble in London. It's extraordinary. When they were borrowing before the crash, what they're actually doing with it in a lot of cases is investing, borrowing from a bank, taking the money on deposit and investing it in banks in Iceland. When those banks in Iceland crashed in 2008, local authorities lost £1 billion in deposit. So they're basically speculating by borrowing from a city here, taking the deposits, investing in Iceland, and some of those councils like Kent, Barnet, still getting their money back from the Iceland crash. The companies that were advising them to do this, most of them were linked to senior conservative politicians, people like Michael Fallon, the defence minister, Michael Spencer, who was a Conservative treasurer in the lead up to the 2010 election, and Angela Knight, who ran the banking lobby in the system. Money which has to be taken from workers' wages, from funds for libraries, for housing, and nobody's looking at this issue. So in 2015 I worked with Channel 4 Dispatches to basically expose what's been going on and how councils have been getting involved in these loans. The council we spent the most time looking at was Newham, which is the biggest borrower and has the most debt with the highest interest rates. So here you can see current Bank of England rate, 0.5% interest. What's Newham paying? 7.6% interest. Newham is wasting £8 million every year of your money that we could reclaim from the banks if Newham actually took any action on this. So what I'm interested in doing here is just helping to kind of expose this issue and try and build a social movement to expose what the council's been doing, understand why it's happened, and to hold the people responsible for it accountable. 80% of all the money they bring in from council tax is going to pay off these loans. 80%. So if the money they get from households paying tax to the borough, 80% of that goes straight to Barclays and RBS before they spend a cent on services. So Newham is basically almost four times the London average in terms of debt to council tax ratio. And for me, when I look at figures like more than 12,000 people homeless in the borough, and I see the council wasting that much money, I just want to scream. It's unforgivable. You look at what they're spending money on. Here's how much money Newham's spending on housing services, about £20 million. And here, £35 million interest payments to just 3 banks. So it's basically the same amount as environmental services, public health, going straight to banks and interest payments.
And so we're trying to put up a fight, but when I see this, just makes me really sick that the people who are working hard for living and working in Newham, who are on the front line, are being told, now I'm sorry, you can't actually afford to live here anymore, and the rent's probably going to go up by God knows how much in a few years' time.
When the local authorities were forced to sell off their housing, that money went to the government. And, it's all been slipped through without people knowing about it. Is it getting into the election process, is what I'm trying to say.
So it's still not very well known about because, for instance, the BBC refused to publish anything about it. I've been campaigning on it for 4 years. The BBC, I've spoken to Newsnight, BBC London Radio, Panorama, Radio 4, basically every BBC platform you can think of, no one will publish on it. So until you actually get coverage in the media and politicians to speak. It's hard to get traction on this, but yes, in touch with Momentum, in touch with local campaign groups, but it's a very slow progress, particularly for a tiny campaign with few resources. So I mean, we do what we can, but it's we're talking about a national issue. There's been much more movement in Scotland, funny enough. So this issue is actually getting a lot of traction up in Scotland, but we're a little bit behind the 8 ball here in England and Wales.
Thank you, Joe.